Hello, everyone. Welcome to this year's GIS Day at UBC. I'm extremely thankful for everyone taking the time to come out today. Grateful to those of you listening to my presentation. My goal today is to kind of share a bit about myself as a GIS professional, the path that took me to my current company, Candrone, and some projects that we've worked on in the past. By the end of the presentation, I'd love to hear your questions and kind of encourage you to think about how your specific knowledge of GIS would apply to some of these projects. So, just making sure I'm up there. So first, I'd like to introduce myself, tell you how I got to where I am today, and kind of speaking to an audience of GIS professionals like yourself, especially at UBC, one of the coolest universities in Canada. I'm very excited to kind of talk about what we have here. So several years ago, I started at University of Guelph, and I studied environmental geoscience and geomatics. Obviously, that's out in Ontario, not BC, but it's all one country. So as the name implies, my bachelor's was actually a very broad science, covering areas of geology, climatology, humanities, GIS and remote sensing, and various other areas. While this sounds like a huge field with hundreds of different paths to take, there were actually only 4 other individuals in my academic year. Over the years, they've actually changed the title of the program to just environmental geomatics now, which is a testament to how novel this field of science is, even though the idea of remote sensing has been around for centuries. You can also tell that my jacket doesn't have the right degree on it, so, things change. But while in school, my research took on many different avenues, mostly related to hydrology and flood modeling, and I even began a master's at the same university. We were monitoring the eutrophication of the Great Lakes through agricultural runoff in southern Ontario. We used 40 years of historical Landsat data to observe overland runoff, trying to see basically which farms were providing the nutrient leaching to specifically Lake Erie, and trying to identify where the cause was and kind of where the concentration was as well. So shortly after engaging in that research, I received an offer to move out west, which I've always wanted to do, and I became a geospatial data technician for Candrone. And over the years, I've actually now become a GIS specialist. What do those terms mean? I'm sure you've heard GIS versus geospatial versus geomatics, all those different terms. As far as I understand, nobody has a concrete, agreement in terms of what those mean. But I like all of them. I think they're fun. So GIS Specialist is the title that now is on my LinkedIn. And so before I get into what I do for Candrone, I want to introduce who we are and what we do. So the company is Candrone, and we do everything from selling drones to teaching new and experienced individuals how to fly and process data, to conducting survey-grade LiDAR captures for some amazing companies. We have a lot of stories to tell, and I'm excited to share some of them with you today. So while we have sales, rentals, marketing, tons of other departments, I want to focus on our services team, which is the team that I'm currently a part of. A quick overview, we have a dedicated team of professionals with diverse experiences involved in surveying, data processing, training, programming, flying, and obviously many more. While drone is in our name, some of our coolest projects were actually captured via a very heavy LiDAR unit that could only be carried by like a helicopter. I think we used a manned fixed-wing aircraft at the time. So very cool, but drones are not the only way we get our data. So with how diverse our team is, we also have a diverse clientele. While this isn't an exhaustive list, we have worked on so many different projects that this has been the perfect opportunity for me to dip my toes in as many areas of GIS as possible, in such little time too. You may be studying or working in GIS right now and asking yourself, where do I want to go? What do I want to create? If you're anything like me, you're kind of tired of explaining to everyone who asks what you do as, oh, it's just like Google Earth, but a bit different. So hopefully you can relate. If you are interested in drones specifically, we do provide high quality training services that kind of get you anywhere from a hobby pilot to an actual full GIS pro, processing LiDAR data most often to just make 3D models of whatever you can legally fly over. While I'm a certified flight reviewer, I actually mostly do LiDAR and photogrammetry processing training. So if you have any questions about learning more about that, please come see me after the presentation. I'd love to share my knowledge. So what do I specifically do at Candrone as a GIS specialist? Well, essentially I play a part in everything from the planning of a mission to the data capture. And then specifically for me, my bread and butter is the processing and delivery of that data to the clients. One of the many challenges in our industry isn't just knowing how to get the raw data into a nice deliverable. It's being able to communicate with the client and understand what it is that they're actually looking for. So some of our most interesting projects have been the result of a conversation completely derailing in a meeting and just the client asking, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we could see X or, investigate Y? And that turning into an answer of just, well, why don't we try? So what I'd like to do now is to go through some of those projects that we've done in the past, just to give you a glimpse of what we've done at Candrone, some of the projects I've worked on, and some of the challenges that have appeared as a result. What I want you to keep in mind is just how would you solve some of these problems? Something like the FME stuff, I've seen the acronym a ton of times. I've never actually dove into it, although I would like to now. So with that in mind, how can you maybe have found a solution that would have helped us out faster than we did, or more effectively than we did? So the first project I want to talk about is this Lower Mainland digital twin. So the project emerged as a result of one of those conversations where the client asked, would it be possible to detect this? We originally spoke with our contact. It was First Nations for the region, and we were discussing a LiDAR data set. And specifically, I was trying to sell, possible flood mitigation strategies that they could develop as a result of, digital elevation models, DEMs, soil saturation indices from multi-spec cameras, and tons of other deliverables. And they were kind of buying into it, but then in our conversation, they mentioned the potential detection of historical settlements, we call them. Essentially, it's evidence of previous inhabitants across their land. So I came up with a solution to use the LiDAR to create a DEM that would look for physical depressions in the ground that resembled the imprint of a foundation or evidence of agriculture, really anything we could spot. We called these features cultural depressions and have since done multiple projects across BC using that same workflow and obviously developing it. We hit several challenges along the way, mostly related to data capture. Of course, there's difficulties making payments or coordinating helicopter flights, ensuring the camera's even turned on, things like that. But one thing we didn't consider is just how something like snow was going to affect our LiDAR capture. Mapping out 1,000 square kilometers takes a decent amount of planning, and we had a limited amount of time to get this done. So one of the things that we thought about regarding snow and just the seasonal changes is if we fly too early, we catch the forest before the leaves have fallen, meaning we reduce the number of points that our LiDAR unit can capture beneath the foliage, which is what we really needed to create our deliverable. On the other hand, if we fly too late in the season, we risk snowfall, which will cause problems for actual true elevation values, and not to mention the colorization of the point cloud. Essentially, it's just all going to look white. So even then, you can plan it all perfectly, end up with rainfall or the smoke from wildfires, and it completely changes our deliverable. So tons of fun challenges that we experienced, and didn't stop there. So the next one we had was this underground hydro dam mapping challenge that we had. So the challenge was we wanted to create an accurate 3D model of the inside of an operating underground hydro tunnel. The tunnel was about 600 meters long, had tons of sharp bends throughout the tunnel, and there was compromised access through the dense overgrown vegetation. There's obviously unknown conditions in the tunnel. I recall it was actually filled up mostly with water for most of the distance. The model needed to be georeferenced to survey grade level accuracy, typically within 2 centimeters. And then there was also issues of things like there's low-flying helicopters regularly going over the landing zone. So the solution is we kind of developed a customized drone with a flotation device, also known as a pool noodle, and customized lighting, and then also an autonomous mapping and navigation payload. It's an Australian company known as Emerson. They make this thing called the Hover Map. It uses SLAM technology, which I can dive into if you're curious, but essentially it's not just processing LiDAR data, it's doing it real time and kind of almost working the way that our own eyes do. It is mapping its 3D space while being in flight, therefore giving itself kind of eyes, and then obviously giving us a deliverable to use later. So the result was we wrote and adopted a comprehensive standard operating procedure, and eventually we got the effective completion of the mission, and as far as I'm aware, no near misses, and it was very cool. So before I get into the next and final project, I want you to consider what I call the 3 pillars of resolution. So we first have spatial resolution, meaning like the accuracy of our data. Spectral or radiometric resolution, basically just how we're using the wavelengths of light, how we're manipulating the bandwidths, which are we using near infrared, are we just using RGB imagery, that kind of stuff. And then finally, temporal resolution, which is the frequency and timing of what we were actually trying to map. So the final project I want to introduce is the process of landmine detection, mostly in war-torn countries such as Ukraine, Rwanda, Libya, Niger, and obviously many others. Rather than actively locating and safely diffusing landmines, which wasn't really our responsibility, our goal was to use various remote sensing techniques to identify anomalies within imagery captured by our drones, and then assist in the identification for on-site military efforts to obviously go and manage those landmines. So how would you go about identifying landmines using nothing but a drone and really any sensor at your disposal? So when we first met with our client, we started by brainstorming kind of any method we could use to potentially identify an object resembling a landmine. For reference, the most effective method currently identified by most research studies, or at least the ones that I could find, they utilize GPR, which is ground penetrating radar. It's highly effective, but it also often requires you to fly this sensor just like centimeters above the ground, which for the purposes of our landmine removal, probably not going to be super effective for us, obviously in the event of hitting the ground. So first we identified that we could use other types of optical imagery, multiband stuff, and that's kind of where we started. So first, with a false color composite, we could potentially identify camouflaged objects on the ground as a result of their reflective properties, obviously not visible to the naked eye. Then we considered thermal variances, understanding that a metal landmine is going to heat up during the day differently than the surrounding soil, so potentially we can detect that. Afterwards, we considered using various spectral indices, such as like the NDVI, which is the Normalized Vegetation Difference Index. Basically, it just looks at the health of vegetation using the change of near-infrared light, and I think it also uses the red band as well. So we thought, there's a good chance that grass growing over a previously laid landmine probably not going to have the same level of vegetative health as the surrounding grass. Potentially, we can detect that. Finally, we looked at even the possibility of just investigating like the topographical changes, assuming that basically a 3D model, either via photogrammetry or LiDAR, would allow us to identify potential landmines. So with all of these methods, we aim to use various machine learning techniques to have these ideas, basically the input data, go through our algorithm, learn how to predict these anomalies easily, and pretty much by anybody with a drone and access to the sensor. Our goal was not to just have data come back to us and be processed, but for us to actually create a solution that anybody can use to identify those landmines on their own. So in the end, we chose a multi-spec camera. I believe it was the MicaSense, although you'll want to confirm that with me, and ran various image processing and analysis stages. First one we tried was called ISO data. It's basically iterative self-organizing data analysis technique, or what we'll call ISO data. And it's an unsupervised classification, which gave us kind of the first level glance of the image. In simple terms, ISO data classification just involves grouping pixels in an image into different classes based on their spectral characteristics. We found this technique to be effective, but less effective than a random forest model, which is a supervised classification technique. So for a random forest model, essentially it's a classification technique using machine learning to classify pixels in an image into different land cover classes. In simple terms, it involves manually training a data rather than just letting it learn on its own. And you manually train it on a set of labeled pixels to learn the spectral characteristics of different land cover classes. And then using that model, we classified unlabeled pixels in the image. So for this analysis, we ended up choosing a spread of 50% training data set, 30% test data set, and then 20% validation data set. Because even if we are spot on accurate, we need to have some sort of control data to be able to put that into numbers and therefore give some sort of conclusive evidence that our process works. And as a result, we created 4 discrete classes. Basically, we called them identified ordnance, potential mine site, disturbed earth, and unidentified object. And you can see those here. So this is just one of the sites and one of the preliminary results of our analysis. So showcasing 4 of those different classifications of anomalies. Remember, we're not necessarily saying they are landmines yet. We're just kind of identifying here are 4 anomalies that we agree to be significant enough to point out. So first, we have the identified ordnance. These locations feature objects that are readily identified from the band combination and the image segmentation analysis. Then we had potential mine site. These were locations that feature depressions and or displaced surface material, typically indicative of like digging or burying of objects. The classification also identifies these locations as belonging to a cluster with kind of distinctive color patches. Then we had disturbed earth. So these locations are pretty similar to the potential mine site, but with less certainty. So both visual and preliminary analysis have found it kind of difficult to ascertain if it were mere disturbances or maybe false positives. So again, these are just classifications at the moment, but not actually telling them, hey, there's definitely a landmine here. And then lastly, we have unidentified object. So these locations feature objects that are kind of alien to the natural composition of the landscape, but also distinctively different from the other three classes that we've identified already. So here's a zoomed in image of some of just the RGB optical imagery of, we classified it, now we go look at it with the RGB imagery to kind of verify, did we actually pick something up? Now, there's not enough information here to tell for sure what it is, but it's enough to point out that, hey, maybe let's not farm on this land just yet. Let's take an investigation with an actual bomb disposal squad or heavy machinery to really make sure that it's safe to go back to planting and starting up production again. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation and kind of investigating some of these projects with me. If you're interested in this kind of work, I strongly urge you to reach out to Candrone, as we're always looking for excited GIS professionals, or at least GIS enthusiasts, to kind of help us break new grounds in different industries. If you guys have any questions, I'd love to hear them, and I appreciate your time.